The studio lights dimmed as Jonathan Roumie walked onto the late-night talk show set, his sharp black suit cutting through the dim backdrop. Just moments before, host Jon Stewart had made a remark that sent shockwaves through the audience. He had made a comment about politicians from urban districts using race to win political battles, a remark many saw as a direct dig at representatives like Roumie. The 48-year-old actor-turned-politician had been invited to discuss criminal justice reform, but what would follow would turn a typical political interview into a viral moment that would dominate social media for weeks. Stewart, known for his provocative humor and years of controversial takes, assumed he could easily handle another young politician. He was wrong. What Roumie did in the next 20 minutes didn't just surprise Stewart. It left him visibly shaken, scrambling for answers and facing the most significant backlash of his career. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a masterclass in how to dismantle someone who underestimated their opponent. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these incredible political moments everyone will be talking about tomorrow. Jon Stewart sat behind his familiar desk, the spot where he'd hosted politicians, celebrities, and intellectuals for over 2 decades. At 62, the comedian turned political commentator had built his reputation on saying what others wouldn't dare. His show had become a weekly destination for political junkies, known for its panel discussions and Stewart's often controversial monologues. Stewart prided himself on being politically incorrect, often claiming he spoke truth to power regardless of who got offended. He'd survived multiple scandals, lost shows, and bounced back stronger. His audience loved his willingness to challenge both sides of the political spectrum, though critics often accused him of crossing lines, especially when it came to race and social issues. Tonight, Stewart had planned what seemed like a standard segment on criminal justice reform. He'd done hundreds of these interviews with politicians. In his mind, another opportunity to showcase his sharp wit against a relatively new congressman who'd probably stick to talking points. Jonathan Roumie, an actor who had transitioned into political life, was representing a diverse urban district and had already established himself as an articulate and fearless voice in politics. A former lawyer, Roumie had fought for justice in the courtroom long before stepping into the political arena. He knew the legal system's flaws intimately, particularly how it impacted communities of color. He'd come to the show expecting a serious discussion about prison reform and police accountability. What he didn't expect was Stewart's opening comment, which would change the tone of the evening. But Roumie, who had faced tough audiences and challenging debates throughout his career, was not intimidated by a talk show host. This confrontation would become more than just a debate between two individuals. Stewart represented a certain kind of liberal commentator who believed his progressive credentials gave him permission to make comments about race that others couldn't. Roumie represented a new generation of political leaders who refused to let such remarks slide, even from supposed allies. The audience, which included millions of Americans grappling with ongoing conversations about race, was about to witness something different. For Stewart, this was just another episode. For Roumie, it was an opportunity to challenge a harmful stereotype in a way that would shape future political conversations. The trouble began during Stewart's opening monologue, before Roumie even appeared on stage. While discussing recent political developments, Stewart veered into commentary about urban politicians. "You know what I love about these young representatives from urban districts?" he said with his trademark smirk. "They figured out the perfect political strategy. Just call everything racist and watch your opponents scramble." The audience gave uncertain laughter, some clapping, others silent. Stewart continued, "It's like having a trump card you can play anytime someone disagrees with your policies. Can't defend your position on crime? Racism, someone questions your budget proposals? Obviously racist. It's brilliant, really behind the scenes." Roumie's team immediately recognized the issue. His communications director whispered urgently into his phone while his chief of staff pulled up clips on his tablet. They knew this wasn't just a casual comment. It was a talking point that had been used to dismiss politicians of color for decades. When Stewart introduced Roumie, his tone carried an undertone that regular viewers would recognize. Joining me now is Jonathan Roumie, who I'm sure will have some very strong opinions about criminal justice reform. Roumie walked out with a professional smile, but those who knew him could see the calm determination in his eyes. He'd heard the opening monologue from the green room. He'd seen his staff's concerned faces, and he'd made a decision about how this interview would go. As he settled into the guest chair, Stewart leaned back, confident, as if he'd done this dance thousands of times before. Jonathan, thanks for joining us. I was just talking about how young politicians from urban areas approach political discourse these days. What's your take on that? The question seemed innocent enough, but Roumie recognized it immediately as a trap. Answer defensively and he'd be proving Stewart's point. Ignore it, and he'd be letting a harmful stereotype stand unchallenged on national television. Well, John, Roumie began, his voice steady and measured, I think it's interesting that you'd characterize political discourse from urban areas in that way. Can you be more specific about what you mean by that? Stewart shifted slightly, sensing that this wouldn't be as easy as he'd expected. I just mean that sometimes, and I'm speaking generally here, there's a tendency to attribute disagreement to racism rather than engaging with the actual policy substance. I see, Roumie nodded. And when you say sometimes, are you referring to specific instances? Because as someone who spent years in courtrooms dealing with actual policy substance, I'm curious about these examples you have in mind. The audience had grown silent, sensing the tension building. Stewart's usual confident demeanor flickered for just a moment. Well, I don't want to call out specific people. Oh, but you already did, Roumie interrupted gently. You specifically mentioned young representatives from urban districts. That's a pretty specific demographic, wouldn't you say? Stewart tried to regain control of the conversation. Look, I'm just saying that sometimes legitimate policy disagreements get characterized as racist when they're really not. I think we can have honest conversations about crime policy, for instance, without someone immediately playing the race card. The phrase "playing the race card" hung in the air like a challenge. Roumie's expression didn't change, but anyone watching closely could see his jaw tighten slightly. The race card, Roumie repeated slowly. That's an interesting phrase, John. Tell me, when someone points out actual racial disparities in our criminal justice system, disparities that are documented by data from your own government agencies, what would you call that? What would you call that? Jonathan Roumie asked calmly, his voice steady as he leaned forward slightly. I'd call it bringing up relevant facts, Stewart replied, clearly not realizing where Roumie was headed. Exactly, Roumie said, pausing for a moment before continuing. So when I mentioned that Black Americans are incarcerated at roughly 5 times the rate of white Americans for the same crimes, according to federal statistics, am I playing the race card or am I bringing up relevant facts? Stewart paused, realizing he had walked into something. Well, those are statistics, right? Facts, data, evidence, Stewart stammered, struggling to regain control. Roumie's voice remained calm, but his words carried more weight with each sentence. So help me understand, John. When exactly does citing documented evidence become playing the race card? Is there a specific threshold, a particular tone I should avoid? Should I ask permission before mentioning racial disparities that affect my constituents? The audience was now fully engaged, some leaning forward in their seats. This wasn't the usual back and forth they expected from these interviews. Stewart, known for his quick wit and ability to control conversations, was clearly struggling to regain his footing. I'm not saying you can't mention racial disparities, Stewart said, his voice slightly defensive. I'm talking about when everything becomes about race, even when it might not be. Everything? Roumie repeated, his eyebrows raised. That's another interesting word choice. Can you give me an example of when I've made everything about race inappropriately? Stewart looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. Well, I'm not specifically talking about you personally, but you introduced me as someone from an urban district right after a monologue about politicians who supposedly call everything racist. So either you were talking about me personally or you were making assumptions about me based on where I represent. Which is it? The trap was now fully visible to everyone in the studio. Stewart had painted himself into a corner with his own words, and Roumie was systematically closing off his escape routes. In the control room, producers were frantically whispering to each other. This wasn't going according to their usual script. The show's executive producer, a veteran of decades in television, had never seen anything quite like this unfold in real time. Their guest wasn't just defending himself, he was systematically dismantling Stewart's credibility using his own words against him. The social media manager, monitoring online reactions in real time, watched the engagement numbers spike beyond anything they had seen before. Comments were flooding in faster than the moderation team could handle them. Some viewers were praising Roumie's intelligence and preparation, while others were expressing shock at seeing their familiar host so thoroughly outmaneuvered. Should we go to commercial? Whispered one producer to another. but the executive producer shook his head. Whatever was happening, it was television gold, the kind of unscripted moment that would be talked about for years. They had to let it play out. Meanwhile, in the green room where other potential guests waited for future segments, a prominent political consultant was quietly taking notes on his phone. He recognized immediately that he was watching a masterclass in political communication that would be studied in campaign schools and media training programs across the country. The camera operators, veterans of countless political interviews, were making subtle adjustments to capture the full drama of the moment. They zoomed in on Stewart's increasingly uncomfortable expressions, caught Roumie's composed confidence, and panned occasionally to audience members whose faces showed they understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The show's head writer, responsible for crafting Stewart's usual sharp comebacks and witty responses, was sitting helplessly as his carefully prepared material became irrelevant. This wasn't a scripted exchange where clever one-liners would save the day. This was a systematic deconstruction of assumptions and stereotypes that required substantive responses Stewart clearly wasn't prepared to give. Security personnel trained to handle disruptions from audience members or unexpected events found themselves in uncharted territory. There was no disruption to manage, no crisis to contain, just a guest who was using intelligence and preparation to completely change the power dynamics of their host's own show. Stewart attempted to deflect by changing the subject. Look, let's talk about your criminal justice reform proposals. Some critics say they're too soft on crime, especially for violent offenses. But Roumie wasn't going to let him escape that easily. I'm happy to discuss policy, Jon, Roumie said, his voice unwavering. But first, I think we should address what just happened here. You made some pretty serious implications about how politicians like me operate, and I think your audience deserves clarification. He turned slightly toward the audience, acknowledging them directly. Because here's what I heard in your opening monologue and your questions to me. You suggested that politicians from urban districts, let's be honest about what that's code for, routinely cry racism instead of engaging in substantive policy discussions. Stewart tried to interrupt, but Roumie continued smoothly. You used the phrase playing the race card, which has a very specific history and meaning. And then you brought me on as an example of this supposed problem. So let's talk about that. I'm a former public defender who spent years in courtrooms before running for office, Roumie continued, his voice gaining strength. I've represented clients facing decades in prison, fought for police accountability measures, and worked on legislation that's reduced recidivism rates in Texas by 12% over the past 2 years. Roumie reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a small folder. I brought some statistics with me tonight because I believe in backing up my positions with facts. Would you like to see them? Stewart, clearly uncomfortable with how the tables had turned, nodded reluctantly. Texas Department of Criminal Justice data shows that our evidence-based reform programs have saved taxpayers $47 million while reducing repeat offenses. The reforms I've advocated for are based on successful models from red states like Georgia and Texas, implemented by Republican governors, Roumie said, setting the folder on Stewart's desk. These aren't emotional appeals, Jon. This is evidence-based policymaking. So when you suggest that politicians like me just play the race card instead of doing substantive work, what exactly are you basing that on? Stewart reached for his usual deflection tactics. I'm not saying you specifically, but you are, Roumie interrupted, his tone still professional, but increasingly pointed. You brought me on this show immediately after making those comments. You introduced me in a way that connected me to your opening monologue. So let me ask you directly. Have you actually looked at my legislative record? Do you know what bills I've sponsored, what committees I serve on, what my background is? The silence stretched for several seconds, an eternity in television time. Stewart's mouth opened and closed without producing words. His usual quick wit seemed to have completely abandoned him, leaving him looking exactly like what he was in this moment, unprepared and exposed. The camera operator zoomed in slightly on both faces. Stewart's expression cycled through confusion, embarrassment, and a growing realization that he was losing control of his own show. Roumie's face remained composed, patient, like a prosecutor who had just asked the question that would break open his entire case. In the control room, the show's producers exchanged worried glances. They could see the social media metrics spiking in real time as clips of this exchange began circulating. The engagement numbers were through the roof, but not in the way they'd planned. This was supposed to be a standard political interview, not a masterclass in how to expose media bias, one producer whispered. I'll take that as a no, Roumie said gently, his voice carrying just enough disappointment to make it sting. So, you made assumptions about my approach to politics based on what exactly? The fact that I represent a diverse urban district? The fact that I'm a young politician? Help me understand the logic here, John, because I'm genuinely curious about how this works in your mind, Jonathan Roumie continued, his voice steady, taking on the tone he had used in his most persuasive arguments. Here's what I think happened, he said, leaning forward, his gaze unwavering. You saw a young politician coming on your show, and you immediately assumed I would fit a stereotype you've created about politicians who look like me. You didn't research my background, my record, or my actual positions. You just figured I'd be another politician who plays the race card. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Roumie's calm, deliberate speech made his points even more powerful. But here's the irony, John, Roumie continued, his voice firm. The only person who's made this conversation about race is you. I came here to discuss criminal justice policy. You're the one who brought up urban politicians and playing the race card. So who's really making everything about race here? Stewart, visibly flustered, attempting damage control. Look, I think you're mischaracterizing what I said. Am I? Roumie responded, raising an eyebrow as he pulled out his phone. Your producer sent me a transcript of your opening monologue. Would you like me to read it back to you? The color drained from Stewart's face. He clearly hadn't expected Roumie to come this prepared. Roumie continued, You said, and I quote, they figured out the perfect political strategy. Just call everything racist and watch your opponent scramble. What you then said, it was like having a trump card you can play anytime someone disagrees with your policies. Those are your exact words, John. Roumie leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his gaze intense. So let me ask you something, and I want a straight answer. When a politician cites documented racial disparities in the justice system, disparities that exist, whether I mention them or not, do you consider that playing the race card? Stewart stammered, clearly caught off guard. Well, it depends on the context. No, it doesn't, Roumie interjected firmly. Either facts are facts or they're not. Either documented evidence matters or it doesn't. You can't have it both ways. Roumie turned to address the audience directly. This is exactly the problem we face in politics today. When people of color point out documented inequalities, we're accused of playing the race card. When we cite statistics, we're told we're making everything about race. When we bring evidence to support our positions, we're dismissed as emotional or divisive. Roumie's voice rose slightly, the first hint of emotion creeping in. But here's what I want everyone watching to understand. I didn't bring race into this conversation. Jon did with his opening comments, his characterizations, and his assumptions about who I am and how I operate as a legislator. He gestured toward the audience, his movement deliberate and inclusive. Every person in this studio heard those opening remarks. You heard the coded language, the assumptions, the stereotypes dressed up as political commentary. And now you're seeing what happens when someone refuses to play along with that narrative. Looking directly at Stewart, his gaze unwavering, Roumie continued, You created a stereotype about urban politicians and then tried to make me fit into it. When I didn't cooperate with your narrative, when I responded with facts and evidence instead of getting defensive, you've struggled to adjust because your entire approach was based on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. The audience was fully engaged now, some nodding along with Roumie's words. Several people in the front row were leaning forward, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented in the usually controlled environment of late-night television. This is exactly what happens to politicians of color across this country every single day, Roumie said, his lawyer's instincts taking over completely. We're expected to defend ourselves against stereotypes rather than discuss our actual work. We're supposed to prove we're not what people assume we are, instead of being evaluated on our merits and accomplishments. He pulled out his phone and held it up slightly. I have 37 pieces of legislation with my name on them. 14 have become law. 3 have saved taxpayers over $60 million. But instead of discussing any of that, I'm here explaining why citing racial disparities isn't playing the race card. It's called doing my job. The conviction in Roumie's voice was building, but his tone remained professional, controlled. When I mentioned that Black Americans are 3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, despite equal usage rates across racial lines, that's not an emotional appeal. That's data from the Department of Public Safety. When I point out sentencing disparities in our courts, I'm citing federal statistics, not grievances. Stewart attempted one last deflection. I think you're being overly sensitive. Overly sensitive, Roumie repeated, shaking his head with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. There it is, the final piece of the puzzle. When a black politician refuses to accept coded language and demands accountability, she's being overly sensitive. When she comes prepared with facts and responds intelligently to loaded questions, suddenly she's the problem. Roumie leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone he'd perfected in countless courtroom closing arguments. It's almost like you're reading from a script, Jon. First, make assumptions based on stereotypes. Then, when those assumptions are challenged with evidence, claim the person as being too emotional or too sensitive. It's a playbook as old as American politics itself. The studio had fallen completely silent except for the hum of cameras and lights. Even the production crew seemed frozen, recognizing they were capturing something that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. The studio audience, which had been silent throughout most of this exchange, began to murmur. Some people started clapping slowly, then others joined in. The applause built gradually until it filled the studio. Stewart sat behind his desk, his usual confident demeanor completely shattered, his face flushed, his hands fidgeting with papers he wasn't reading. For perhaps the first time in his television career, he appeared genuinely speechless. Roumie sat calmly, watching him process what had just happened. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't gotten emotional, hadn't done any of the things Stewart had implied he would do. Instead, he had systematically dismantled Stewart's arguments using the very skills that had made him successful in courtrooms across the country. As the commercial break hit, the tension in the studio was palpable. Stewart sat slumped in his chair, staring at the desk while his producers huddled nearby, frantically whispering about damage control. The audience remained in their seats, many still processing what they just witnessed. Roumie used the break to check his phone, where notifications were already flooding in. His communications director, watching from the green room, gave him a thumbs up. They both knew this moment would define conversations about race and politics for weeks to come. When cameras rolled again, Stewart attempted to salvage the interview by pivoting to policy discussions, but the damage was done. Every subsequent question felt hollow after what had just transpired. Roumie answered professionally, providing detailed policy positions that showcased exactly the kind of substantive engagement Stewart had claimed he was incapable of. Conservative voices were more divided in their responses. Some acknowledged Roumie's skill even while disagreeing with his politics. "I don't agree with his positions, but he absolutely demolished Stewart," wrote one right-leaning commentator. "He walked right into that one. You have to respect the preparation and execution." Others tried to defend Stewart, arguing that his comments had been taken out of context or misinterpreted, but these defenses gained little traction as more clips circulated, showing the full context of his opening monologue and subsequent questions. The most shared clip became Roumie's moment when he listed his legislative accomplishments. "I have 37 pieces of legislation with my name on them. 14 have become law. 3 have saved taxpayers over $60 million. The stark contrast between his concrete achievements and Stewart's vague assumptions resonated with viewers across the political spectrum. Young political staffers, particularly those working for politicians of color, began sharing the clips with comments like, "This is required viewing," and "Study this response." Communication directors started using the exchange as a case study in how to handle loaded questions and coded language in media appearances. The phrase "overly sensitive" began trending separately, with users sharing examples of times when legitimate concerns raised by women and people of color had been dismissed with this exact language. The hashtag overly sensitive became a rallying cry, with people sharing stories of times they'd been told they were being too sensitive when pointing out discrimination or bias. Media outlets beyond American borders picked up the story within hours. Political commentators across different countries used the exchange as an example of how conversations about race and politics were evolving in American media. Several noted that Roumie's approach, methodical, evidence-based, and professionally delivered, represented a new model for how politicians could challenge media bias in real time. Television critics and media analysts immediately recognized the significance of what had occurred. This wasn't just another political disagreement on a talk show. It was a real-time example of how conversations about race play out in mainstream media spaces. Several prominent journalists pointed out how Stewart's approach reflected broader problems in political commentary. The assumption that young politicians of color are somehow less substantive or more likely to play the race card is exactly the kind of thinking Roumie exposed, wrote one media critic. Others noted how Roumie's legal background had prepared him perfectly for this moment. He treated this like a courtroom, building his case methodically and closing off escape routes. Stewart never stood a chance once Roumie took control of the narrative. The aftermath extended far beyond television criticism. Democratic leaders quickly praised Roumie's performance, with several senior members tweeting their support. "This is the kind of voice our party needs," wrote one veteran congressman. "Smart, prepared, and unafraid to call out problematic behavior wherever it comes from." Republican responses were more muted, though some acknowledged his effectiveness even while disagreeing with his positions. The incident became a talking point in political strategy circles, with communication directors studying Roumie's approach for future reference. What happened between Roumie and Stewart represented something larger than one television exchange. It became a case study in how coded language about race operates in supposedly progressive spaces and how effectively that language can be challenged when someone comes prepared. Media literacy experts used the clip in workshops and classes, pointing out how Stewart's language choices, urban politicians playing the race card, overly sensitive, revealed assumptions about political leaders of color that persist even among liberal commentators. In the days following the show, Stewart attempted various forms of damage control. He issued a statement saying his comments had been misinterpreted and that he had great respect for Roumie's work. But the statement only drew more criticism for failing to address the specific problems Roumie had identified. During his next show, Stewart made oblique references to the controversy, suggesting that some people couldn't handle honest political discussion. But clips of those comments only reinforced the perception that he hadn't learned from the experience. Roumie, meanwhile, used the increased attention strategically. He appeared on several other programs over the following weeks, each time demonstrating the same combination of preparation and policy expertise that had made his The Daily Show appearance so effective. He also used his increased profile to highlight the criminal justice reform work that had brought him on Stewart's show in the first place. "This is why representation matters," Roumie said in one interview. "When people make assumptions about what politicians like me are capable of, they're really making assumptions about the communities we represent." The Roumie-Stewart exchange became a reference point for future discussions about race in political media. Other politicians, particularly younger Black and Latino representatives, began citing it as an example of how to respond to coded language and subtle bias. Media training programs started including scenarios based on the exchange, teaching political figures how to identify and respond to similar situations. The incident became a case study in communication schools across the country. Scholars of media and politics quickly recognized the exchange as a significant moment. Several academic papers analyzed Roumie's rhetorical strategies, noting how he used Stewart's own words against him while maintaining a professional demeanor throughout. Linguists pointed out how effectively Roumie had decoded and challenged the racial subtext in phrases like urban politicians and playing the race card. His approach became a model for how to address coded language in real time. Months later, the Roumie-Stewart exchange continued to influence political and media conversations. It had demonstrated that the era of politicians passively accepting coded racial language, even from supposed allies, was ending. For young politicians of color, Roumie's performance became inspirational. He had shown that preparation, intelligence, and strategic thinking could effectively counter even experienced media figures who relied on outdated assumptions and stereotypes. For media figures, the incident served as a warning that audiences were becoming more sophisticated about identifying and rejecting coded language. The old playbook of making assumptions about politicians based on their demographics was no longer sustainable. The exchange raised important questions about the future of political discourse in America. If established media figures could no longer rely on coded language and subtle bias, how would political conversations evolve? Would other politicians follow Roumie's model of systematic, evidence-based responses? The incident also highlighted the growing influence of younger politicians who had grown up in an era of social media awareness and media literacy. These leaders were less likely to accept traditional power dynamics and more willing to challenge problematic behavior in real time. What started as a routine political interview became a defining moment in conversations about race, media, and political discourse. Jonathan Roumie's systematic dismantling of Jon Stewart's assumptions demonstrated that a new generation of political leaders was prepared to challenge coded language and demand accountability, even from supposed allies. The exchange proved that intelligence, preparation, and strategic thinking could effectively counter decades of media assumptions about political leaders of color. It showed that the old rules of political discourse, where certain figures could make coded comments without consequence, were changing. Most importantly, it demonstrated that when someone comes prepared with facts, evidence, and clear thinking, they can change the entire dynamic of how these conversations happen. Roumie didn't just defend himself, he exposed and challenged a broader pattern of thinking that affects how political discussions happen across America. The lesson for anyone watching was clear. Never underestimate someone based on assumptions about their background, or your demographics. In a world where information travels instantly and audiences are increasingly sophisticated, the truth has a way of emerging, and those who rely on outdated stereotypes do so at their own risk. For those who enjoyed watching this incredible political moment unfold, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing exchanges that everyone will be talking about. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought about how Jonathan Roumie handled this situation. What other political figures do you think should watch and learn from his approach?